Welcome to Vendetta Files, where mysterious cases' secrets come back into the light. Unsolved crimes and forgotten stories leaves a trace.
The winter of 1888 remains etched in my memory, not merely for its biting frosts, but for the singular series of events that began on the morning of December the 26th. London was draped in a heavy yellow shroud of fog, a pea souper of such density that the carriage lamps on Baker Street appeared as nothing more than ghostly ethereal blurs. Inside our rooms at 221B, the fire crackled with a festive cheer that stood in stark contrast to the mood of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. To the average man, Boxing Day is a time of digestion and repose. To Holmes, it was a period of stagnant boredom that bordered on the pathological. He had spent the morning pacing the rug with the lithe, predatory grace of a caged panther, his hawk-like features set in an expression of profound melancholy. "You have been to the docks this morning, Watson," Holmes remarked suddenly, without turning from the window where he stood watching the swirling mist. I looked up from my copy of the British Medical Journal in startlement. I had indeed ventured out early to tend to an old army comrade who had taken ill near the Rotherhithe Infirmary, but I had been most careful to brush my clothes upon my return. "My dear Holmes," I cried, "this is too much. I have been back for an hour. I have changed my coat, and I have sat quietly by the fire." "How could you possibly know?" He turned, a faint sardonic smile playing upon his thin lips. "The logic is elementary, though the application requires a keen eye. You possess a peculiar habit, Watson, of tucking your trousers into your boots when the slush is deep. While you cleaned your boots, you neglected the small indentation behind the heel of your left trouser leg. It bears a faint reddish smear of clay, a specific ochre variety used exclusively as ballast in the repair of the southern wharves, coupled with the fact that you smell faintly of Stockholm tar, a scent that clings to the cordage, of ships. The conclusion is inevitable." "Marvelous," I admitted, sinking back into my chair. "Commonplace," he retorted, his eyes losing their momentary spark. "I crave mental exaltation, Watson. I crave a problem that the pedestrian mind of Scotland Yard cannot grasp. But the criminal classes have lost all imagination. A dull season, Watson, a dreadfully dull." A frantic, rhythmic pounding at the street door interrupted his lament. A moment later, we heard the hurried footsteps of Mrs. Hudson, followed by the heavy, stumbling ascent of someone in a state of extreme agitation. The door burst open to reveal a man who looked as though he had seen a phantom. He was tall and spare, dressed in the expensive but now disarrayed furs of a gentleman of means. His top hat was missing, his silver hair was wild, and his face was the color of a parchment scroll. "Mr. Holmes!" he gasped, clutching the doorframe for support. "You must come at once. It is impossible. It is a nightmare conjured from the very depths of the pit." Holmes was on his feet in an instant, his boredom vanishing like mist before the sun. He steered the man to the settee and poured him a glass of brandy from the sideboard. "Pray, compose yourself, sir," Holmes said, his voice calm yet commanding. "You are speaking to friends. Am I correct in addressing you as Mr. Silas Vance, the private secretary to the Earl of Arncott?" The man gasped, nearly dropping the glass. "You know me? I recognize the crest on your signet ring, and I observed the frantic manner in which you were checking your pocket watch, a chronometer of a type often gifted to loyal staff by the Arncott estate. Now, tell us, what has occurred at Arncott Manor to bring a man of your standing through such a fog in such a state?" Vance took a shuddering breath. "It is the Earl, Mr. Holmes. Lord Julian is dead. Murdered, I fear, though the manner of it defies every law of nature." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "Go on." "As you may know," Vance continued, "the Earl was a man of eccentric. Since the death of his lady 10 years ago on Christmas Eve, he has spent the anniversary in total seclusion within the Hall of Tapers, a vast, windowless library at the heart of the manor. Every year, he locks himself in at sunset with nothing but a crate of candles. He claims to spend the night in luminous meditation, and no one is permitted to enter until the sun rises on Boxing Day. A sentimental ritual, I remarked. "A deadly one, Dr. Watson," Vance replied. "This morning, when the sun failed to pierce the fog, I went to the door to announce the hour. There was no answer. With the help of the butler, I forced the heavy oak door. The room was sealed from the inside, 2 iron bolts and a massive key still in the lock. "And what did you find?" Holmes whispered. "The room was filled with the scent of spent wax," Vance said, his voice trembling. Hundreds of candles had burned down to their sockets. In the very center of the floor, Lord Julian lay dead. He was in his evening dress, untouched by any weapon. But Mr. Holmes, the candles, they were arranged in a perfect unbroken circle around him. And though the Earl always insisted on pure white beeswax, every single candle in that room, hundreds of them, had turned a deep midnight blue, and the expression on his face. It was not the face of a man who died of a heart attack. It was the face of a man who had looked into the very eyes of Shuck himself. Holmes stood, reaching for his ulster and his deerstalker, a locked room, a ritualistic circle, and a chemical transformation of the light. "The game is afoot, Watson. We must reach Arncott Manor before the local constabulary tramples what few threads of truth remain in that hall of shadows." The journey to Arncott Manor was a somber affair. We travelled by a special train from Waterloo, the locomotive's rhythmic thrumming echoing the frantic beating of my own heart. Holmes remained in what I termed his brown study, shrouded in silence, his chin resting. Upon his drawn-up knees, eyes fixed on some point far beyond the wooden panels of our first-class carriage. He did not speak a word until we transitioned from the train to a waiting brougham, which rattled through the iron gates of the Arncott estate. The manor itself was a brooding Tudor-style edifice, its jagged gables and twisted chimneys clawing at the leaden sky like the fingers of a drowning man. It was a house built for secrets, a place where the weight of centuries seemed to press down upon the very air. Upon our arrival, we were met by a weeping housekeeper and a stony-faced butler, but Silas Vance led us directly past them, through a labyrinth of dark oak-panelled corridors to the heart of the house. "Here," Vance whispered, stopping before a massive door of reinforced oak. The Hall of Tapers. The door hung slightly askew on its hinges where it had been forced. Holmes stepped inside, and I followed, immediately struck by a sensation of profound chill. The room was vast and windowless, a cavernous library where the walls were lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes protected by heavy glass cases. The air was thick, not with the dust of age, but with a sharp, acrid scent that stung the nostrils, the ghost of 1,000 extinguished flames. In the center of the polished mahogany floor lay the late Earl of Arncott. He was a man of perhaps 60, his features handsome even in the distorted mask of his demise. He lay on his back, his hands clawed as if trying to tear the air itself. Surrounding him was the most singular sight I have ever beheld in my years as a medical man. A perfect circle of candles, perhaps 300 in number, stood in an unbroken ring around the body. As Vance had described, they were not the white beeswax one would expect in a nobleman's home. Every single candle was a deep midnight blue, a shade so dark it appeared almost black in the gloom. The wicks were charred, and the melted wax had pooled into grotesque frozen shapes. Upon the floor, "Remarkable," Holmes murmured. He was already on his knees, his magnifying glass out, crawling across the floor with the intensity of a bloodhound on a scent. "Tell me, Vance, was anything moved before my arrival?" "Only the Earl's body, briefly, by the local doctor to confirm death," Vance replied. "But I insisted he leave everything else exactly as it was. Dr. Morton said it was a cardiac episode brought on by nervous shock, but he could not explain the candles. Morton is a fool," Holmes snapped, his nose inches from a blue wax pool. "A heart does not stop in a vacuum. Look here, Watson, what do you make of the ventilation?" I looked up. High above, near the vaulted ceiling, were 4 small decorative iron grills. They appear to be standard air shafts, Holmes, necessary, I imagine, to prevent the Earl from suffocating while burning so many candles in a sealed room. "And yet," Holmes said, rising and walking toward the forced door, "observe the bolts. Massive hand-forged iron. The key was inside the lock, you say?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I had to use a crowbar from the stables to snap the housing." Holmes examined the snapped metal with a frown. Then he turned back to the circle. He began to pace the perimeter of the room, his eyes scanning the floorboards, the bookshelves, and the heavy velvet curtains that draped the far wall, despite there being no windows behind them. He stopped suddenly at a small, ornate side table that held a single silver snuffer and a matchbox. "Watson," he called, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. "Tell me, what do you see on this table?" I stepped closer, squinting in the dim light. A snuffer, a box of Bryant and May matches, and a small, crystalline smudge. It looks like salt, perhaps. Holmes touched his finger to the smudge and brought it to his tongue. His expression darkened. "Not salt, Watson. Potassium chlorate. And look at the matchbox. One match has been struck, but the head is missing entirely." "Is that significant?" I asked, struggling to find the thread. "In a room where the very light has changed its nature, everything is significant." He then performed a most peculiar action. He knelt by one of the blue candles, scraped a tiny portion of the wax into a glass vial, and then held his pocket lamp to the wick of an unburnt stump. As the flame took hold, the candle did not burn with a yellow light. It flared with a ghostly, sputtering violet hue before Holmes blew it out. "A chemical masquerade," he whispered. "The Earl did not die of a fright, Watson. He died because someone turned his sanctuary into a laboratory of death. But the how is secondary to the why. Look at the Earl's right hand." I bent over the corpse. The fingers were stiff with rigor mortis, but between the thumb and forefinger was a tiny, almost invisible scrap of what looked like blue silk. "A fragment of a lady's glove?" I suggested. "Or a signal," Holmes replied, his eyes darting to the shadows in the corner of the room. "Vance, who else was in the house last night? I want a list of every guest, every servant, and most importantly, I want to know who supplied the Earl with his white beeswax candles this year." As Vance hurried away to comply, Holmes turned to me, his face pale in the shadows. "We are dealing with a mind of high order, Watson, a mind that understands that the most effective way to hide a murder is to dress it in the garb of a miracle." The drawing room of Arncott Manor was a cavernous space, draped in heavy tapestries that seemed to swallow the meager light offered by the fog-choked morning. A fire struggled in the grate, casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled household. As I sat by the hearth, notebook in hand, I could not help but feel the oppressive weight of the Earl's eccentricities. Holmes, however, seemed to thrive in this atmosphere of gloom. He stood by the mantel, his sharp eyes darting from face to face with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. Silas Vance had gathered the primary residents, Lord Arthur Arncott, the Earl's nephew and heir, Miss Beatrice Thorne, the Earl's ward, and Gable the butler, whose face remained an inscrutable mask of Victorian propriety. "The situation is quite clear, Mr. Holmes," Lord Arthur began, his voice betraying a jagged edge of impatience. He was a man in his late 20s, dressed in a flamboyant smoking jacket that seemed ill-suited for a house of mourning. "My uncle was a man of fragile nerves and strange superstitions. The strain of his annual vigil simply overcame him. It is a tragedy, certainly, but hardly a matter for the police, or for private investigators." Holmes tilted his head, his gaze settling on Lord Arthur's hands, which were twitching rhythmically against his thighs. "A tragedy indeed, Lord Arthur. Yet, tragedies rarely involve the spontaneous chemical transformation of 300 beeswax candles. Tell me, did you spend the evening here in the drawing room?" Arthur stiffened. "I was in the billiards room until midnight. The fog was too thick for me to return to my own lodgings in the village. I retired early. Ask Gable, he brought me a brandy at 10. "I did indeed, sir," the butler intoned, "though I did not see Lord Arthur again until the alarm was raised this morning." "And you, Miss Thorne?" Holmes turned his attention to the ward. She was a pale, delicate woman with eyes that seemed reddened by genuine grief. She clutched a lace handkerchief, her fingers tracing the intricate embroidery. "I was in the chapel, Mr. Holmes," she whispered. "On the anniversary of my lady's death, I always spend the midnight hour in prayer. It was the Earl's wish that we all observe the night in our own way." "The chapel is at the far end of the east wing, is it not?" Holmes asked, "quite a distance from the Hall of Tapers." "It is," she replied. "I heard nothing. No one did. The walls of this house are thick, and the Earl's library is virtually soundproof." Holmes paced the length of the rug, his hands clasped behind his back. A house of silence and prayer. And yet, Gable, I noticed a peculiar detail upon our arrival. The silver service in the dining room has been polished recently, but the candelabra remain untouched, coated in a fine layer of dust. Why is that? The butler blinked, his composure momentarily ruffled. The Earl gave strict instructions, sir. No candles were to be lit in the house yesterday save for those he took into the hall. He wished for the rest of us to remain in reverent darkness to honor the memory of the Countess. Reverent darkness, Holmes repeated, his voice trailing off as he stopped before a glass-fronted cabinet containing a collection of rare minerals. He pointed a long, thin finger at a specimen of deep blue stone. Lapis lazuli, a beautiful pigment. It is a pity it is so often wasted on trifles. He turned back to the group, his expression suddenly stern. Vance, you mentioned the candles were supplied by the usual chandler. Who is this man? Mr. Henderson of Cheapside, sir, Vance replied. He has provided the Earl's white beeswax for 20 years. The crates are delivered a week in advance and placed in the library foyer. And who had access to that foyer this past week? Anyone, I suppose, Vance admitted, glancing nervously at Lord Arthur. The servants, the guests, the doors are rarely locked during the day. Holmes's eyes flashed with a sudden predatory light. Watson, I believe it is time we examined the Earl's correspondence. A man who spends his nights in luminous meditation often leaves behind more than just ash and wax. As the suspects dispersed, Lord Arthur with a huff of indignation and Miss Thorne with a quiet sob, Holmes leaned toward me. What do you make of them, Watson? The nephew is clearly in debt, I remarked, recalling the frayed cuffs of his expensive jacket and his nervous agitation. And the ward seems genuinely devastated. But Holmes, the candles, how could 300 candles be swapped without anyone noticing? And why blue? The why is the heartbeat of the crime, Watson, but the how involves a knowledge of chemistry that suggests our culprit is more than a mere fortune hunter. Did you notice Miss Thorne's handkerchief? I saw her clutching it, yes. It was stained, Watson, not with tears but with a faint oily residue, the same residue I found on the floor of the library. She claims to have been in the chapel, yet she carries the scent of the laboratory upon her person. And yet, Lord Arthur's boots, did you see them? They were clean, I said. Exactly, Holmes cried. In this slush and mud, they were impeccably clean. A man who claims to have stayed in the billiards room all night has boots that look as though they were polished 5 minutes ago. One is too dirty, the other is too clean. Between the two, the truth lies hidden like a needle in a haystack. He grabbed his hat. Come, Watson, we must visit the stables. I have a suspicion that the Earl's reverent darkness was breached by more than just a ghost last night. The fog had not lifted, if anything, it had grown more suffocating, a damp woolen blanket that muffled the sounds of the world. As Holmes and I stepped out of the heavy oak doors of Arncott Manor, the transition from the stifling atmosphere of the drawing room to the frigid courtyard was a welcome relief. Holmes did not head for the main gates. Instead, he turned sharply to the right, navigating the slushy path toward the stables with a purposeful stride that I found difficult to match. The stable yard was a bleak expanse of grey cobbles and half-melted snow. You noted Lord Arthur's boots, Watson, Holmes said, his voice cutting through the mist. Impeccably clean. For a man residing in a house surrounded by a sea of mud, such cleanliness is not a virtue, it is a confession. He has changed his footwear, and he did not do so in his bedroom, for I took the liberty of glancing through his open door while Vance gathered the household. There were no muddy boots to be seen. Then where would he hide them? I asked. A man of his breeding does not like to soil his own quarters with the evidence of his nocturnal wanderings. He would seek a place where mud is expected. We reached the stable block, a long, low building of red brick. The smell of horses and damp hay rose to meet us. Inside, the stalls were quiet, save for the occasional stamp of a hoof and the rhythmic mastication of the Earl's prize hunters. Holmes bypassed the horses and headed straight for the tack room at the far end. It was a small, cluttered space filled with a scent of saddle soap and oiled leather. A single lantern flickered on a hook, casting long, swaying shadows. Holmes began a systematic search, his hands moving with incredible dexterity through chests and behind hanging harnesses. Aha! He reached behind a stack of heavy winter blankets and pulled forth a burlap sack. With a flourish, he emptied its contents onto a mounting block. Out tumbled a pair of patent leather evening shoes, caked in thick yellowish clay, the very same clay I had seen at the wharves, though here it was mixed with the local garden soil. But it was not the shoes that held our breath. Alongside them lay a glass-stoppered bottle, half filled with a fine cobalt blue powder, and a pair of surgical gloves stained with the same midnight hue. "The blue pigment," I whispered, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "And the gloves. It seems the case against Lord Arthur is complete. He had the motive, the inheritance, and here is the means." Holmes picked up the bottle, rotating it slowly in the lantern light. He uncorked it, took a cautious sniff, and then touched a microscopic grain of the powder to his sleeve. "Copper ammonium sulfate," he murmured, "a potent colorant. When mixed with molten wax, it would indeed produce that deep blue hue. And when burned, the presence of certain chlorides would produce the violet flame we observed." "It is an open and shut case, Holmes," I cried. "We must inform Lestrade, or at least Vance." Holmes did not look satisfied. In fact, his brow was furrowed in deep thought. He picked up one of the boots and examined the sole with his glass. "Tell me, Watson," he said, "does anything strike you as peculiar about this smoking gun? Only that it is a damning collection of evidence, precisely. It is too damning. Look at the placement of the bag. It was behind the blankets. Yes, but not hidden with any real intent to remain found. It was positioned so that anyone searching the tack room would inevitably stumble upon it. And the boots. Look at the wear on the heel." I leaned in. The heel of the right boot was significantly more worn on the outer edge than the left. "Lord Arthur," Holmes continued, "walks with a slight inward cant, a result of a polo injury he sustained 3 years ago. I observed it as he paced the drawing room. These boots, however, belong to a man with a perfectly neutral gait. Furthermore, while the clay is the same as that found on the manor grounds, there is a trace of coal dust embedded in the wax of the laces. There is no coal handled in this stable. It is kept in the cellar of the main house." "Then these are not Arthur's boots? They are his size and they are his style, but they are not his walk," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. "This is a calculated piece of misdirection, Watson. Someone wishes us to believe the nephew is the culprit. They have provided the mud, the pigment, and the motive, all wrapped in a convenient burlap package." He shoved the items back into the bag and replaced it exactly where he had found it. "We are being played, Watson, like a pair of second-rate violins. The real murderer is someone who not only knows the Earl's secrets, but also understands the mechanics of a Holmesian investigation. They are feeding us the evidence they think I want to see. But if not Arthur, then who? We must look to the one person who has been too quiet," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The one who stands to gain nothing from the Earl's death, yet has been most helpful in guiding our footsteps." Suddenly the stable door creaked open. A tall, thin shadow fell across the floor. We turned to see Gable, the butler, standing in the doorway, his face as pale as a shroud. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice trembling, "you must come back to the house at once. There has been another discovery. In the Hall of Tapers, it is Miss Thorne. She has collapsed and she is speaking in tongues." Hall of Tapers had, if possible, grown even more oppressive in the short hour since we had left it. The acrid scent of the blue wax remained, but it was now overlaid with a sharp, clinical smell of smelling salts. Beatrice Thorne lay reclined on a velvet chaise longue that had been brought into the library, her face a mask of porcelain fragility. Silas Vance stood over her, looking helpless, while Gable the butler hovered in the shadows like a sentinel. "She was found by the maid," Vance whispered as Holmes approached. She had returned to the room, supposedly to retrieve a prayer book she had dropped earlier. We found her slumped near the center of the candle circle, weeping and speaking of the blue fire and the judgment of the ancestors. Holmes did not immediately go to the lady. Instead, he stood at the edge of the circle of blue candles, his eyes tracing the floor with an intensity that seemed to vibrate through his thin frame. He looked at the spot where the Earl had died, then at the position where Miss Thorne had allegedly collapsed. "Speak to her, Watson," Holmes murmured. "You are the medical man. See if her delirium is of the mind or the nerves." I stepped forward and took the young woman's wrist. Her pulse was rapid and thready, her skin clammy to the touch. She opened her eyes, which were clouded with a vacant, terrifying intensity. "The light was wrong," she moaned, her voice a jagged whisper. "The Earl knew. He told me the white flames would turn when the sins of the house were full. Blue, the color of the cold grave. I saw him, Mr. Holmes. I saw the shadow move across the books. Which books, Miss Thorne? Holmes asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. The ones that breathe, she gasped, her eyes rolling back as she drifted into a state of semi-consciousness. A most affecting performance, Holmes remarked, his tone suddenly chillingly dry as he turned away from the couch. Performance, Mr. Holmes? Vance cried, sounding scandalized. The poor girl is half out of her wits with grief. Grief is a powerful stimulant, Mr. Vance, but it does not usually grant a person the ability to defy the laws of physics, Holmes replied. He walked over to one of the massive glass-fronted bookcases. He pointed to a small gap between two heavy volumes of the Chronicles of the Plantagenets. Watson, look at the dust here. Or rather, the lack of it. I leaned in. A thin, clean line ran along the mahogany shelf, as if a small object had been recently slid across it. And now, Holmes continued, observe the girl's handkerchief once more. He reached down and delicately plucked the lace cloth from Miss Thorne's limp hand. He brought it to his nose, then passed it to me. I sniffed. Chloroform? A trace, Holmes said, but mixed with something more exotic. Belladonna, perhaps, to dilate the pupils and simulate the appearance of terror. Miss Thorne is indeed suffering, but she is suffering from a carefully self-administered dose of theatricality. He turned back to the room at large, his eyes lingering on the iron ventilation grills high above. Vance, Gable, take Miss Thorne to her rooms. She requires rest and, I suspect, a lack of an audience. Watson and I shall remain here to conduct a more silent investigation. Once the room was cleared and the heavy oak doors were shut, the silence of the library became absolute. What is it, Holmes? I asked. You've seen something that has changed the entire complexion of the case. Several things, Watson. But the most striking is the inconsistency of the secret clue, the one our murderer forgot to hide. He walked to the very center of the candle circle. The Earl was a man of ritual. He burned these candles for 10 years. Look at the floorboards directly beneath where his head lay. There is a small, circular depression in the wood, perfectly polished. It is where he placed his silver snuffer every year. I see it, I said. And yet, Holmes pointed to the side table we had examined earlier, the snuffer is over there 5 yards away. A man as obsessed with ritual as the Earl would not change the placement of his tools on the very night he expected a miracle. Furthermore, look at the candles themselves. He knelt, pointing to a single blue candle that stood slightly out of alignment with the others. What about it? It is the only one in the entire room that is not caked with the soot of the violet flame. It was placed there after the Earl died. But why? Why add one more candle to a circle that was already complete? Holmes reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pair of tweezers. He carefully pried the wick of the suspicious candle apart. Nestled deep within the blue wax, hidden from casual observation, was a tiny, coiled sliver of copper wire, thinner than a human hair. A detonator, I suggested. No, Holmes whispered, his face alight with a dark joy. A conductor. Watson, we are not looking for a murderer who used a knife or poison. We are looking for a murderer who used the very atmosphere of this room as a weapon. The blue candles were not just for show, they were the conduit. He stood up, his eyes fixed on the ventilation grill. The nephew is a distraction, the ward is a decoy, the butler is a witness, but the architect of this crime is someone who knows that in a room. Full of fire, the most dangerous thing is not the flame, but the air it consumes. Suddenly, a low whistling sound echoed through the library. It was coming from the air shafts. Holmes froze, his hand dropping to his side. The pressure is changing, Watson. Someone is at the bellows. Out with the lamp, quickly. As the library plunged into darkness, I felt the unmistakable sensation of a cold draught, and the faint, sweet smell of almonds beginning to fill the air. The darkness of the Hall of Tapers was absolute, a heavy velvet weight that seemed to press the very breath from my lungs. The whistling sound from the ventilation grills grew sharper, a high-pitched metallic hiss that vibrated through the floorboards. Then came the scent, sweet, cloying, and terrifyingly familiar. Cyanide, I gasped, reaching for my handkerchief to cover my mouth. Holmes, we must get out. It's prussic acid gas. Do not move, Watson. Holmes's voice rang out from the darkness, sounding strangely distant. The gas is heavier than air. It will pool on the floor first. Stand upon the library steps, quickly." I scrambled in the dark, my hands finding the cold wood of the rolling library ladder. I climbed several rungs, my heart hammering against my ribs. A moment later, the flare of a match illuminated the room. Holmes was standing atop the Earl's reading desk, his face pale and angular in the flickering light. He wasn't looking for the door, he was staring at the ceiling. "The draft is reversing," he muttered, his eyes wide and brilliant. "The pressure is being manipulated from the cellar. A masterstroke, Watson. To kill the Earl with a ritual, and to kill the investigators with the very air they breathe." With a sudden, violent movement, Holmes swung his heavy walking stick at the glass-fronted bookcase nearest the vent. The glass shattered with a deafening crash. He reached inside, grabbed a handful of heavy folios, and began jamming them into the ventilation opening with a frantic, erratic energy. "Holmes, the door!" I cried, the stinging scent beginning to rise. "The door is likely barred from the outside by now, my dear fellow. Our host is nothing if not thorough." He leaped down from the desk with the agility of a mountain goat and seized a heavy iron poker from the cold hearth. Instead of attacking the door, he began to rhythmically strike the floorboards in the corner of the room. Clang, clang, hollow. "Here," he shouted. He wedged the poker into a seam and heaved. A small trapdoor, used for the ancient heating pipes of the manor, groaned open. "Down, Watson! It is a foul crawl, but it leads to the service ducts." We dropped into the narrow, soot-choked passage, just as the library above us became a tomb of invisible poison. We crawled for what felt like an eternity, the darkness suffocating, until we emerged into the damp, cold air of the coal cellar. But the horror of the night was not yet finished. As we stumbled out into the lower corridor of the manor, we heard a choked, gurgling cry. We rushed toward the sound, finding ourselves near the servants' entrance. There, sprawled across the stone floor, was Silas Vance. The private secretary was clutching his throat, his face a terrifying shade of purple. A small silver tray lay overturned beside him, a shattered glass of water pooling on the floor. "Vance!" I knelt beside him, my medical instincts taking over. His pupils were pinpoints, and his breath came in ragged, agonizing gasps. "He's been poisoned, Holmes. Not the gas. This was ingested." Holmes did not kneel. He stood over the dying man, his behavior becoming increasingly bizarre. He began to hum a discordant tune, his fingers drumming against his chin. He ignored my plea for assistance, instead picking up a shard of the broken glass and holding it to the light of a wall sconce. "The sediment," Holmes whispered, his voice trembling with a strange, dark excitement. "He didn't drink the water, Watson. Look at the tray. Holmes, the man is dying. He is already beyond your help, Watson. Look at the tray. The tray is dry beneath the glass, but wet at the edges. He was trying to dispose of something before he fell." Vance's hand went limp. With a final shuddering breath, he was gone. The household, alerted by my shouts, began to spill into the corridor. Lord Arthur appeared, his face a mask of shock, followed by Gable, whose usual composure had finally shattered into a look of pure terror. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur demanded. "Vance? Is he dead?" Holmes said, turning to face them. His eyes were wild, his hair disheveled from the crawl through the ducts. He began to pace the narrow corridor, his steps erratic, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or tap the stone walls. "The secretary has been silenced. A second crime to cover the first, or perhaps a falling out among thieves. What do you think, Lord Arthur? Or you, Gable? Does the reverent darkness feel a bit more crowded now?" "You are speaking madness, Holmes," Arthur cried. "You look like a man possessed." "I am possessed, sir. Possessed by the beauty of a logic so cold it could freeze the Thames." Holmes suddenly stopped and pointed a long, trembling finger at the butler. "Gable, fetch me the Earl's accounting ledgers and a bowl of hot water. I must wash the soot from my soul, and then I shall show you how a man can be murdered by a candle that was never lit." He turned and strode away toward the drawing-room, leaving the stunned household standing over the corpse of Silas Vance. I hurried after him, deeply concerned. I had seen Holmes in the grip of a case before, but this was different. There was a fever in his eyes that suggested he was no longer merely solving a mystery. He was entering into a private duel with a ghost. The hours following Silas Vance's death were the most trying I have ever endured in the company of Sherlock Holmes. He had retreated into a state of what appeared to be manic eccentricity. He spent an hour in the drawing room, not speaking but playing a series of discordant, screeching notes on his Stradivarius that set my teeth on edge. Then, abruptly, he demanded that the entire household be confined to their rooms for their own safety, while he performed what he termed a spiritualist census of the Hall of Tapers. "Holmes, this is madness," I whispered, catching him in the corridor as he carried a bundle of silk and a basin of pungent chemicals. "The man was poisoned before our eyes. There is a murderer in this house, and you are playing at ghosts." He stopped, his eyes burning with a light that was both terrifying and brilliantly sane. "The murderer is not in this house, Watson. The murderer is this house. Every stone, every vent, every candle is part of a machine. To catch the engineer, I must first break the machine's rhythm." By 11 o'clock that night, a deathly silence had fallen over Arncott Manor. The fog had pressed against the windows until the glass seemed to groan under the weight of the damp. As per Holmes's instructions, I sat in the darkened drawing room with Lord Arthur, Beatrice Thorne, who looked like a marble statue in her mourning weeds, and Gable. We were a tableau of suspicion and fear, illuminated only by the dying embers of the hearth. Suddenly the heavy doors swung open. But it was not Holmes who entered. It was a figure draped in the Earl's own velvet dressing gown, the face obscured by a low-hanging hood. The figure moved with a stiff, unnatural gait toward the library. "Uncle?" Beatrice gasped, her voice cracking with terror. Lord Arthur stood, his face white. "It's a trick. Holmes, is that you?" The figure did not respond. It vanished into the gloom of the east wing. I followed, my service revolver in hand, the others trailing behind me in a state of hypnotic dread. We reached the Hall of Tapers, the doors of which stood wide. Inside, the room was no longer dark. A single brilliant blue flame flickered in the center of the room. It sat atop the very spot where the Earl had perished, but the room had been transformed. Holmes had moved the library ladders to form a sort of tripod over the flame, and from it hung a series of glass vials connected by rubber tubing. "Step no closer!" a voice boomed, not from the figure in the gown, but from the high shadows of the gallery above. We looked up. Sherlock Holmes stood upon the narrow walkway of the upper shelves, silhouetted against a small lantern. He looked like a vengeful deity. "The trap is set," Holmes cried. "The blue shadow that took the Earl is hungry again. It fed on the master of the house. It fed on the secretary who tried to blackmail the master's shadow, and now it seeks the one who pulled the bellows." "What are you talking about?" Arthur shouted, his voice high with panic. "Behold the secret of the candles." Holmes ignored him, pointing to the blue flame below. The candles were never beeswax. They were cast from a compound of white phosphorus and copper salts, coated in a thin shell of paraffin. They were designed to burn at a specific rate, releasing a heavy, invisible vapor, a vapor that, when it reached a certain concentration, reacted with the very air pumped in through those vents to create a vacuum of oxygen. The Earl didn't just die of fright, he was meticulously smothered by the light he loved. He leaned over the railing, his gaze pinning each of us in turn. But there was a flaw. The reaction leaves a residue, a specific crystalline structure on the wicks. I have simulated that reaction in these vials. Within 5 minutes, the vapor will fill this room again. It will seek the path of least resistance, the source of the draft. "You'll kill us all," Beatrice screamed. "Only the one who knows how to stop it," Holmes retorted. "The one who knows that the reverent darkness was achieved not by faith, but by a hidden pump in the cellar walls. The one who has the key to the secondary ventilation." As if on cue, the blue flame flared to a blinding, roaring intensity. The air in the room seemed to thin, a sickening pressure building in our ears. I felt the familiar, sweet scent of almonds, cyanide, beginning to waft from the vials. "The key!" Holmes shrieked, his voice sounding genuinely unhinged. "Turn the key, or we all join the Earl in his luminous meditation." In the chaos of the rising smoke and the hissing gas, a figure broke from our group. It wasn't Lord Arthur, and it wasn't the ward. It was Gable, the butler. With a speed and ferocity that defied his age, he lunged not for the door, but for a hidden panel behind the shelf of the Chronicles of the Plantagenets. He twisted a concealed brass handle, his face a mask of desperate, murderous intent. "Curse you, Holmes! Curse your interference!" The hissing stopped instantly. The blue flame died, the poison in the vials, which I later realized was nothing more than colored water and dry ice, ceased its bubbling. Holmes leaped from the gallery, landing lightly on the rug, his erratic manner vanishing instantly to be replaced by a cold, terrifying triumph. "Thank you, Gable," Holmes said, stepping into the light. "I had wondered where the manual override for the gas pump was located. You have been most helpful in pointing it out." The butler froze, his hand still on the hidden lever. From the shadows of the Earl's dressing gown, which had been propped up on a mannequin, stepped a very confused but very much alive village constable, whom Holmes had sequestered earlier. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Gable hissed, his eyes narrowing like a snake's. "You think you have won, but you have no idea who I serve." "Oh, I think I do," Holmes replied, pulling a heavy ledger from his coat. "You serve the debt that Silas Vance discovered in these books, the debt you incurred while managing the Earl's estate for a decade. But more importantly, you serve the man who taught you how to turn a library into a gas chamber." The heavy iron bolts of the Hall of Tapers were drawn once more, but this time the room was flooded with the steady, honest light of several hurricane lamps held by the local constabulary. Gable, the butler, stood in the center of the room, his wrists bound by steel manacles. His face, once a mask of servile devotion, had curdled into a look of predatory loathing. "It is a common failing of the criminal mind, Watson," Holmes began, standing by the central mahogany table as if delivering a lecture at the Royal Society, to believe that by layering complexity upon complexity, one can bury the truth. But to the analytical mind, complexity is merely a series of signposts. He picked up one of the unburnt blue candle stubs. The mystery began with a miracle, the white candles turning blue. To the superstitious, it was a sign from beyond. To the Earl, it was a terrifying omen that likely paralyzed him with dread. But to a chemist, it was a matter of copper ammonium sulfate and a thin veneer of paraffin. "But how did they change in a locked room, Holmes?" Lord Arthur asked, his voice still trembling. "They did not change, Lord Arthur. They were substituted. The Earl's crate of white candles was intercepted in the foyer a week ago. Gable, who had the run of the house, replaced the genuine beeswax with these chemical counterfeits. But he faced a problem. The Earl would notice the color immediately upon entering. Therefore, the candles were coated in a layer of white, temperature-sensitive wax. When the Earl lit them, the heat caused the outer white layer to melt away and bleed into the inner blue core, creating the illusion of a supernatural transformation." "And the violet flames?" I asked. "Potassium chlorate, Watson. I found the trace of it on the side table earlier. It was the accelerant, but the candles were merely the stage dressing. The true weapon was the air itself." Holmes walked over to the hidden panel Gable had revealed. He swung it open to reveal a series of brass pipes and a large, leather-lunged bellows mechanism. The Hall of Tapers was designed to be windowless and airtight for the Earl's meditations. Gable knew this. By manipulating these bellows from the cellar, he could control the flow of air. On the night of the murder, he reversed the intake. He used the heat of 300 burning candles to create a localized vacuum. As the oxygen was depleted, the Earl grew lightheaded and disoriented. That was when Gable introduced the coup de grace. Through the ventilation grills, a concentrated dose of Prussian blue vapor, hydrocyanic gas. "But the locked door," Arthur protested. "The key was on the inside." "A classic misdirection," Holmes said, a glint of triumph in his eye. "The key was indeed on the inside, but Gable did not need to enter the room to kill. He only needed to enter to clean up. He used a simple silk thread, the very blue silk scrap we found in the Earl's hand, threaded through the keyhole to turn the key from the outside once he had finished his work. The Earl, in his final moments of hypoxia, must have reached out and snagged the thread as it was being withdrawn, tearing a fragment away. A small error, but a fatal one for the butler. Holmes then turned his gaze to the body of Silas Vance, which had been moved to the corridor. Vance was the complication. He was not a murderer, but he was a parasite. He had discovered Gable's embezzlement of the Arncott accounts, the missing thousands that were meant for the estate's upkeep. Vance attempted to blackmail Gable, demanding a share of the inheritance Gable hoped to secure by making himself indispensable to a new, younger Earl. Gable realized that Vance would never be satisfied, so he prepared a second trap. "The tray," I whispered. "Precisely, Watson." Gable treated the silver tray itself with a contact poison, a concentrated alkaloid that would be absorbed through the skin when Vance lifted the glass. Vance realized he was poisoned almost immediately and tried to wipe the tray clean as he collapsed, but the residue remained in the wood of the table where he set it down. Gable let out a low, guttural snarl. He was a fool. They were all fools. The Earl with his meditations while the roof rotted, and Vance with his pathetic greed. "I have spent 30 years tending to this tomb. I deserved more than a pittance in the Earl's will. What you deserved, Gable, and what you shall receive are two very different things," Holmes said coldly. "Inspector, take him away. I believe you will find the remainder of the blue pigment and the bellows blueprints hidden beneath the floorboards of the butler's pantry." As the police led the snarling man away, Beatrice Thorne stepped forward, her face pale but composed. "Mr. Holmes, you have saved this house from a darkness worse than any ghost. How can we ever repay you?" Holmes picked up his hat and gave a perfunctory bow. "By ensuring that the Hall of Tapers is fitted with a proper set of windows, Miss Thorne. Light is the best disinfectant for both rooms and souls. The dawn that broke over Arncourt Manor on the morning of the 27th was a pale, watery affair, but it was greeted with a profound sense of relief. The suffocating yellow fog had finally begun to drift toward the sea, leaving the ancient stones of the estate glistening with a cold, cleansing dew. As the local police carriage rattled down the long gravel drive, carrying a silent, manacled Gable toward the county gaol, a strange stillness settled over the house. It was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the quiet of a convalescent after a fever has broken. Lord Arthur and Beatrice Thorne stood upon the front steps to bid us farewell. The transformation in them was marked. The heir appeared humbled, his flamboyant air replaced by a somber realization of his new responsibilities, while the ward's grief seemed to have found a more natural, peaceful outlet now that the miracle had been exposed as a calculated cruelty. "You have done more than solve a crime, Mr. Holmes," Lord Arthur said, shaking my friend's hand with genuine fervor. "You have cleared the air in more ways than one." Holmes, however, seemed strangely preoccupied. He had spent the hour before our departure in the butler's pantry, conducting a solitary search that had left his fingers stained with ink and his expression unusually grim. As we settled into the carriage that would take us to the railway station, he remained silent, staring out at the retreating gables of the manor. "A singular case, Holmes," I remarked, lighting my pipe as we reached the station platform. The chemistry alone was fascinating. To think that a man's own devotion to a candlelit ritual could be turned into a weapon against him. It was a masterpiece of villainy. "A masterpiece indeed, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes following the steam rising from the locomotive. "But masterpieces are rarely the work of a single apprentice. Did it not strike you as odd that a butler, a man of limited education and even more limited travel, could master the complexities of hydrocyanic gas and temperature-sensitive wax? Gable was a meticulous servant, yes, but he was no chemist." I looked at him in surprise. "You mean he had an accomplice? Perhaps Lord Arthur after all?" "No, not Arthur, and certainly not the secretary. No, Watson. Gable was merely the hands. The brain lived elsewhere." He reached into his pocket and produced a small, crumpled scrap of paper that he had evidently salvaged from the butler's quarters. He handed it to me. It was a fragment of a letter, written in a cramped, precise hand that suggested a mind of terrifying discipline. Only a few lines remained. "The blue transition must be absolute to ensure the paralytic effect of the spectacle. The vacuum will suffice for the physiological requirement. Ensure the pump is lubricated with the odorless oil provided. I expect the legacy to be settled by the new year." There was no signature, only a single stylized letter stamped in the corner of the parchment, a capital M intertwined with a series of geometric lines that looked like a spider's web. "A signature!" I cried. "Who is this M?" Holmes's face darkened, a shadow passing over his features that I had rarely seen. "A phantom, Watson, a man who sits like a spider in the center of a vast invisible web of crime, his threads stretching into every corner of the empire. I have encountered his handiwork before, though never so close to the heart of the aristocracy. It seems the Earl's meditations had drawn the attention of a predator far more dangerous than a disgruntled butler. Then Gable was merely a pawn who was willing to kill for a share of the spoils, but a pawn nonetheless. The M provided the blueprints, the chemicals, and the instructions. Gable provided the opportunity. It is a chilling thought, Watson, that even in the quiet of the English countryside, the reach of such a man can turn a Christmas vigil into a laboratory of death. We boarded the train, and as the English landscape blurred past the window, I watched Holmes. He had taken out his notebook and was sketching the M symbol over and over. His brow furrowed in a way that suggested this case, though officially closed, was merely a chapter in a much larger, more perilous volume. "You look troubled, Holmes," I said. "I am thinking of the candles, Watson," he murmured. Gable thought the blue fire was his triumph, but for the man who designed them, they were merely an experiment. One wonders what other miracles are being prepared in the dark corners of London. He leaned back and closed his eyes. But for today, let us speak no more of it. You have your notes, and the public will eventually have their story. Tell me, Watson, did you find the goose at the manor to your liking? I noticed you had 2 helpings at breakfast. I laughed, the tension finally breaking. It was excellent, Holmes, though I must admit I prefer a meal that doesn't involve the risk of cyanide. An understandable prejudice, he said with a faint smile. As we pulled into the bustling, soot-stained heart of London, I looked at my friend, the man who stood between order and the encroaching shadows, and felt a familiar surge of admiration. The case of the Christmas candlelight killing was solved, but as we stepped onto the platform at Waterloo, I knew that the game was far from over. The fog had finally surrendered to A. Crisp, biting cold by the time we reached the familiar threshold of 221B Baker Street. The scent of the city, a mixture of coal smoke, damp stone, and the distant tang of the river, felt remarkably grounding after the ethereal horrors of Arncott Manor. Mrs. Hudson had, with her customary foresight, left a cold supper of pheasant and a bottle of Montrachet upon the sideboard, along with a mountain of correspondence that had accumulated in our absence. Holmes, however, ignored the food. He immediately went to the corner of the room where his chemical table stood, a chaotic landscape of retorts, test tubes, and stained deal wood. "You see, Watson," he said, holding up a small fragment of the blue wax he had secreted away. "The simplicity of the crime is what made it so effective. To the Earl, it was a ghost. To the butler, it was a fortune. But to the man who designed it, it was merely an equation in atmospheric pressure and chemical reaction." He struck a match and held it to the wax. Once again, that ghostly violet flame flared up, casting long, distorted shadows against the wallpaper of our sitting room. "I find it hard to call it simple, Holmes," I remarked, pouring myself a glass of wine. The orchestration was flawless. Had you not noticed the inward cant of Lord Arthur's boots, or the specific residue on Miss Thorne's handkerchief, Gable might well be enjoying the fruits of his labor this very moment. Holmes waved a dismissive hand, the violet flame reflecting in his keen grey eyes. "Data, Watson. Without data, one is merely a dreamer. The boots told me who wasn't there, the handkerchief told me who was faking. The rest was merely a matter of following the copper salts to their logical conclusion." "And the man M?" I asked, leaning forward. "The one who provided the blueprints for this laboratory of death?" Holmes's expression shifted, the sardonic light dying from his face. He looked at the crumpled scrap of paper with the webbed seal, which he had pinned to the center of his mantelpiece. "There are forces in this city, Watson, that are as invisible as the gas in that library, yet far more lethal. We have pruned a branch in the Arncott woods, but the root remains deep and well-nourished. This M, this architect of ruin, is a man I suspect I shall have to reckon with before our journey is through. He treats the world as a chessboard and lives as the only player who understands the value of the pieces." He turned away from the mantel and began to fill his blackened clay pipe with the pungent shag tobacco he kept in the toe of a Persian slipper. "But let us not dwell on the shadows while the fire is bright," he said, his voice regaining its usual brisk tone. "The Earl of Arncott's soul may rest, the butler will face the hangman, and the young ward has a chance at a life unburdened by superstition. It is a satisfactory conclusion for a Boxing Day outing. And what of you, Holmes?" I asked, watching him as he settled into his armchair, the pipe smoke beginning to curl around his head like a crown of grey wool. "The case began with your lamentation of boredom. Has the Christmas candlelight killing provided the exaltation you craved?" Holmes smiled, a rare, genuine expression of intellectual contentment. "For a few hours, Watson, the mind was stretched to its limit. The puzzle was intricate, the stakes were high, and the adversary was sophisticated. But the tragedy of the analytical mind is that once the secret is out, the miracle becomes a mere commonplace." He reached out and picked up a telegram that had been resting atop the pile on the table. He slit it open with his pocket knife, his eyes scanning the lines with lightning speed. "Aha! It seems the world will not allow me to languish in peace for long. A banker in Greenwich has found his vault empty, despite the locks being untouched and the guards remaining at their posts throughout the night. It seems, Watson, that the new year promises to be every bit as miraculous as the old one." He tossed the telegram onto my lap and reached for his violin. "Come, Watson. The night is young, the Greenwich train leaves at dawn, and I feel a sudden urge to play something by Mendelssohn. Let us leave the blue candles to the past. There are new shadows waiting for us in the mist." As the first soaring notes of the violin filled the room, I looked at my companion, this singular, brilliant, and often frustrating man, and felt a profound sense of privilege. To the world, he was a calculating machine, but to me, he was the most vital heart in London. I took up my pen to finish the final lines of my journal, knowing that as long as Sherlock Holmes walked the streets of this great, dark city, no mystery was truly unsolvable. The violin music had ceased, replaced by the rhythmic scratching of Holmes's pen as he made entries into his massive commonplace books. The telegram from the Greenwich banker lay between us, a stark reminder that the machinery of crime never truly grinds to a halt. Yet, my mind remained tethered to the M we had discovered at Arncott Manor. It was a thread that refused to be severed. "Holmes," I said, breaking the silence of the room, "this M, you spoke of him as a spider. If Gable was merely a pawn, and Vance a casualty of his own greed, then this architect has escaped entirely unscathed. Does it not rankle that the true author of the Earl's demise remains in the shadows?" Holmes laid down his pen and looked at me, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. "It rankles more than I can express, Watson. But in the pursuit of justice, one must sometimes be content with removing the weapon even if the hand remains free. Gable was the weapon. Without him, the M has lost a valuable conduit into the landed gentry of this country." He stood and walked to the window, peering out at the gas lamps of Baker Street. "You asked if the case provided exultation. It did more than that. It provided a warning. For years I have seen the patterns of crime in this city, the burglaries, the murders of passion, the desperate gambles of the debt-ridden. But this was clinical. The use of the copper ammonium sulfate, the manipulation of atmospheric pressure, the calculated use of the Earl's own psychological frailties. It suggests a mind that views human life as a variable in a laboratory experiment. Do you truly believe there is one man behind it all?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes replied, turning back to the room, "that we are entering an age where the criminal will be as well versed in the sciences as the detective. This M, whom I suspect is a man of high standing and even higher intellect, is the herald of that age. He does not commit crimes for the sake of the act. He commits them to test the structural integrity of our society. The Earl was a pillar of the old world. By toppling him with a miracle, M was proving that even the most ancient traditions are vulnerable to the new science. He picked up the blue silk fragment, now safely preserved in a small glass vial. Consider the thread, Watson. A simple piece of silk used to turn a key. It is the perfect metaphor for our adversary. He remains outside the room, pulling the strings, while those inside suffocate in the dark. But he made one mistake. He underestimated the fact that even a dying man might reach out and catch a piece of the truth. "And Gable?" I prompted. "Do you think he will speak?" "Gable is a man of a dying breed," Holmes said, a note of grim respect in his voice. "He is a servant to the core. He served the Earl for 30 years, and then he served a new master. He will go to the gallows with his lips sealed, partly out of fear of what M might do to him even in prison, and partly out of a perverted sense of loyalty to the only mind he found more impressive than his own. Holmes returned to his chair and picked up the Greenwich telegram once more. But we must not let the shadow of the spider dim the light of our victory. The case of the Christmas candlelight killing will be remembered as the night the ghosts of Arncott Manor were laid to rest. The blue fire has been extinguished. He leaned forward, his face illuminated by a sudden spark of his usual energy. And now, Watson, we must look to the future. A vault in Greenwich has been breached by an invisible thief. Does that not stir your blood? A locked room without a drop of blood, yet containing a fortune in missing gold. It is the perfect antidote to the gloom of the Arncott Library. I am ready, Holmes, I said, standing and reaching for my coat. Though I hope this banker doesn't have a penchant for blue candles. Holmes laughed, a sharp, clear sound that filled the room. I suspect we shall find only the most mundane of mysteries there, Watson. Greed, a clever set of skeleton keys, and perhaps a bribed guard. But come, the cab is at the door and the game is afoot once more. As we stepped out into the freezing London night, the air felt crisp and full of possibility. The mystery of Arncott Manor was closed, its lessons etched into my mind. I looked up at the stars, which shone like diamonds through the clearing mist, and felt a sense of peace. The world was a dangerous place, filled with spiders and shadows, but as long as I walked beside Sherlock Holmes, the light of reason would never truly flicker out. The rattle of the hansom cab over the cobblestones of Baker Street provided a rhythmic accompaniment to our journey toward the docks. However, as the familiar silhouette of the Tower of London loomed through the thinning mist, Holmes's mind seemed to drift back one last time to the library at Arncott. He sat with his hands folded in that characteristic steeple-like fashion, his eyes half closed. "You know, Watson," he said softly, "there is a profound irony in the Earl's death. He spent his life searching for a spiritual light, a connection to the other side, and it was his very thirst for a miracle that allowed a most earthly villain to destroy him. If he had been a man of common sense, the sight of a white candle turning blue would have led him to call for his secretary, not to fall upon his knees in prayer. It is the tragedy of the romantic mind, I observed. He wanted to believe that the world was more mysterious than it truly is, and that, my dear Watson, is the greatest weapon in the arsenal of men like our friend M. They understand that the human imagination is a bridge. It can carry a man to the heights of poetry, or it can be used as a scaffolding for his own execution. By dressing murder in the garb of the supernatural, Gable didn't just kill the Earl's body, he paralyzed his will to survive. We reached the station just as the first grey light of a true winter morning began to touch the city. The platform was a hive of activity. Market porters, weary travellers, and the sharp whistle of departing locomotives. It was the world of the living, the world of industry and fact, and it felt remarkably solid after the nightmare of the Hall of Tapers. Holmes stopped at a newsstand and purchased a copy of the Pall Mall Gazette. He scanned the front page, his eyes momentarily lingering on a small notice regarding the sudden passing of the Earl of Arncott. "The world will call it a heart attack," he murmured, folding the paper and tucking it under his arm. "The family will keep the secret of the blue candles to avoid the taint of scandal, and the Hall of Tapers will likely be converted into a sunlit conservatory by the next generation. In a year's time, the only record of the truth will be in that battered tin dispatch box of yours at Cox and Company's bank." "It is a story worth telling, Holmes," I insisted. "It shows that logic can penetrate even the thickest fog of superstition." "Perhaps," Holmes replied, stepping onto the footplate of the Greenwich carriage, "or perhaps it merely shows that for every light we strike, a new shadow is born. But come, Watson. The fog is lifting, the tracks are clear, and a banker in Greenwich is currently pacing his floor in a state of exquisite agitation. We have spent enough time amongst the dead. Let us see what the living have to offer us by way of a puzzle." As the train pulled out of the station, the rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels seemed to pulse with a new energy. Holmes took out his magnifying glass and began to examine the telegram once more, his focus absolute, his spirit restored. I looked out at the sprawling expanse of London, a city of 4 million souls, each with their own secrets, their own tragedies, and their own small rituals. I realized then that while the case of the Christmas candlelight killing was a singular triumph of deduction, Its true value lay in the reminder it provided, that in a world of shifting shadows and clever deceptions, there is no greater security than the steady, unwavering flame of a disciplined mind. The M on the mantelpiece was a problem for another day. For now, there was a vault to inspect, a thief to hunt, and the incomparable company of the master of 221B Baker Street. "What are you thinking of, Watson?" Holmes asked without looking up from his paper. "I was thinking, Holmes, that it is a very good thing for London that you are on our side of the law." He looked up then, a mischievous glint in his eye. "On the contrary, Watson, it is a very good thing for me that the law is occasionally on the side of logic. Now tell me, what do you know of the security measures used in the vaults of the Bank of England? I have a suspicion that our Greenwich thief may have been practicing for a much larger stage." And so, as the sun finally pierced the London mist, we sped toward our next adventure, leaving the blue candles and the ghosts of the past far behind us in the freezing winter air.